I am muted. Hi, everyone. Welcome in. We're going to give it like a minute for people to kind of trickle in and stuff. But yeah, welcome to Yawa. I'm so excited for this conversation we're going to have today. So I'm going to give it like one more minute for people to come in. If you could drop in the chat where you're located and what you're excited about today. So I'm gonna go ahead and kind of get started. So for the beginning of the show, we're going to go to Kai Johnson, and she is a part of our um, Women Engaged team. She's going to give us a legislative update. And I apologize, it's storming really bad. If you're in Atlanta, you get it, you know it. So I apologize if you hear it in the background. But yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and bring on Kai.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kai. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the current If When How Reproductive Justice Legal Fellow with Women Engaged. In my role at Women Engaged and in this YAWA meeting, I provide legislative updates from the Georgia legislature on bills that concern voting rights, reproductive justice, maternal health care, reparations, and more. So let's get started. The legislature convenes today on the 30th day of the legislative session. The end of the session is in sight, and this is when things begin to move very quickly and may change from day to day. Here are some of the issues that are top of mind for women engaged this week. The Senate passed Senate Bill 456 in time for the House to consider it for a vote. Senate Bill 456 would ban the use of mail or telehealth by doctors and healthcare professionals to provide medications used in medication abortions to their patients. The bill now travels to the House and awaits the House's response. The House is allowed to call a hearing for the bill or to not have a hearing on the bill. Currently, the bill is not scheduled for a hearing, which is great news because it can remain this way for the rest of the legislative session. Reproductive justice advocates across the state are asking voters to start contacting their representatives today and tell them to vote no on Senate Bill 456 and to oppose granting a hearing on this bill. The Senate has also passed Senate Bill 338, and this is a great bill for those who give birth in this state. This bill extends postpartum Medicaid coverage to mothers in our state to 12 months. This bill has bipartisan support, meaning support from both political parties, and is projected to be voted on in favor of this legislative session. Finally, Women Engaged has already begun ahead of the next legislative session to advocate for House Bill 45541 ahead of the next legislative session. If passed, this bill would create a reparations commission in the state of Georgia that would research and examine the impact of slavery on the descendants of enslaved people in Georgia and recommend appropriate government reparations and legislation. Look out for opportunities in the coming days and weeks to get involved and to advocate for any of the legislation mentioned here today by following Women Engaged on their social media or by registering to receive updates from us. Also, to reiterate, Women Engaged and reproductive justice advocates across the state are asking voters to contact their representative starting today to tell them to vote no on Senate Bill 456, the anti-medication abortion bill that would prohibit healthcare professionals from using telehealth to send critical reproductive health care to their patients. To be connected with your legislator, please save and call the Reproductive Justice Hotline. The number is 877 357 4004. Again, my name is Kai, and that is all for the legislative updates. I hand it back over to you, Zoe.
Thank you so much, Kai. That was so informative. And yeah, thank you. So now we're going to get into the episode for today. So the theme of the episode is honoring the land we are on, protecting our environment, and fighting environmental racism. So in this background, we discuss understanding and combating environmental racism, the fight to save our planet, and learning how to honor the land we are on. So I'm going to get into our guest, who is Lamisha Whittington. So Lamisha Whittington serves as a Deputy Director for Advanced Carolina and the North Carolina Black Alliance Deputy Director of Programs. Professor Whittington is the co-convener of the NC Black and Brown Policy Network, former National Democracy Campaigner for Friends, I gotta scroll over, Friends of the Earth, former chairwoman of the FRENC Fund Administration, founding member of Democracy Green, former member of the Berks Women's Fund in Western North Carolina, member of the Board of Directors for Cape Fear River Watch, the former NC spokesperson on Fair Courts for the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights, and the community liaison for the National Academics of Science, Engineering, and AMP. Medicine for the guidance on PFAS testing and health outcomes national study. Professor Whittington leads work on intersectional democracy and environmental justice. Professor Whittington serves as an adjunct professor in the Division of Sociology at Meredith College and a lecturer of diversity and environmental justice in the College of Natural Resources at NC State University. Professor Whittington has led guest lectures at NC Central University, NC Central Law School, Shaw University, Duke University, and her work has been seen on PBS, NC, CSPAN, Bloomberg, Bloomberg Law, and a host of other publications. She's a petitioner in 2 active petitions in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, challenging major contaminants of PFAS and 1,4-dioxin. I probably pronounced that horribly. Professor Whittington is an Afro-Indigenous woman from North Carolina, a royal descendant of the former Afro-Indigenous settlement, the Kingdom of the Happy Land. That is a resume. I love that. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Zoe. And I just appreciate you reading the resume. I really do. I felt like I don't know who that is, but I appreciate it.
I want to be you when I grow up. Okay, that's I love that. So I would love for us to kind of start off with like the basics, because I know environmental justice. When I think about it, I think of like you said earlier, like white vegans. So like the topic is kind of new in certain spaces, and so I would love for you kind of explain what environmental racism and justice is, so we can kind of get an idea of it.
That's right. I really appreciate your framing of how it's been really branded and marketed to being a topic that's supposed to be for a specific population, when really Black and brown folks are the most impacted and have been before the name was created by academics. And the name was, as we talk about like ecological terrorism, and we're talking about we see these topics and these terms, and even environmental justice, I'll get into it. The word itself was created in Black community as they were protesting against being dumped on here in North Carolina. And so being from North Carolina, have always been here, like you named, Afro-Indigenous woman. I'm very proud that EJ, environmental justice, the movement itself of pushing back against being dumped on, is what was birthed here by the people in Warren County, Warrenton. And so, but what wasn't new, right, is the concept, as you've already named, environmental racism. That isn't new. We've always protested, and we've always said, okay, we're not accepting that, period. You don't get our consent or our permission to dump on us. But it's been a historical trend in this nation and in other nations, right? Even when we talk about the government, how the U.S. government is created, this government is fairly new. Okay, 246 years of a government. This is a very new government when we compare it to empires from Rome to Egypt to Phoenicia. Like when we talk about the historical timeline, we're replicating systems of harm. So it's nothing new. And so to back up to your question, like where did it start? What is it? As a descendant of, formerly enslaved peoples here in the United States, the concept of corporations and capitalism, which is where we see pollution, contaminants in our waters, you named in my resume, that the 1,4-dioxin did really good with the pronunciation, by the way, PFAS, though the birthing of the contaminants came from corporations, but the corporation model, the corporate structure came from plantations. So when we talk about where did this pervasive inequity start, well, it began with the transatlantic slave trade, the enslavement of our people. And oftentimes we're told in media that there was only one type of plantation, and that's agriculture, cotton, tobacco. And we see that depicted. Now that's true, but there were several other types of plantations, because if our people were picking the tobacco, okay, who was processing it once it was picked? That was free labor as well, right? Once the cotton was picked, cotton didn't just, we didn't pick cotton and then it magically transformed into a, apparel, shirt. No, someone had to process it and create that product. And so it was free labor all the way throughout the manufacturing process. That's your kind of corporation structure, right? So you even had plantations that were textile mills. Industrial plants. Oh, sounds a little familiar, right? Like these dirty industries that don't pay our people enough now. They don't provide healthcare coverage now. There's health disparities in rural communities that we're facing right now, even in COVID-19. Corporations that were not forced, and this is dependent on each state, but I'll use North Carolina as an example. They were not required by the state to social distance, even though we were required to stay at home. So then the highest contraction rate of COVID were in textile mills, industrial plants, industrial animal processing centers. These were the same plantations, the literal structure, the work, the labor, what they were doing inside those structures, the cotton, the tobacco, the animals, that started the plantation model. And so we begin to see that the extraction of the people and the extraction of the land, our oppression was tied together. Not only were we working in these plantations, we had the largest, some of the largest international export during slavery, because it wasn't just producing the crops here and manufacturing them to sell them domestically. It was also sold internationally. So imagine the amount of extraction of the land and the resources that was happening. And it was so awful that data now, scientists say that land in the US South in different states, from Florida to Georgia, North Carolina to Mississippi, some of that land is still unable to be used to this day because the level of harm and extractive practices during slavery, the agricultural extraction was so fast, it's still destroyed today. Now think about that. The impact of slavery is on the people and the land, but that was really when you see environmental racism. That's where it began. Now it's continued. I know we'll get more into conversation of how does it look like today, but we have to start there, because even upon emancipation, we know data tells us that most of the descendants still live within close proximity to where their people were enslaved, right? Like their ancestors. Even me growing up, you know, I came to learn that 15 minutes away from my childhood home was a plantation that my people were enslaved on. And it wasn't even it wasn't something we passed down. It's nothing of honor, right? It was painful, but we're living in proximity to these old plantation structures that are now being and have been used in the Jim Crow to now, right? Reusing these old buildings, reusing this old land to now bring in dirty corporations that use the same labor and then don't pay us, don't protect us, don't provide clean water, clean air, and the like. It's all pretty much the same. So that's environmental racism.
Yeah. Oh my, my mind is like, I don't know why I didn't think about where the cotton or the tobacco or the corn, where does that go after our ancestors were done picking it? I don't know why my mind never went to that. So, oh my goodness, thank you for that explanation. Beautiful explanation. And since you kind of touched on it, and your bio kind of touched on it, you being an Afro-Indigenous woman, I know when people hear that, they may not fully understand what that means. And I would love for you to explain that.
Sure. Thank you for asking about me and my identity and my people. Oftentimes, you know, in America, there's a system that benefits capitalism, and that's confining people ethnically, racially into boxes that fit check one, check two. Like we see this, right? But oftentimes there's a narrative that isn't elevated, that there were people from the African continent. And I'm always very careful when I even say that, because Africa was not the original name of the continent, by the way. That is renamed by someone who was not from that continent. So I always say our people who come from Ethiopia, our people who come from like these other, the ancient names in which was foretold, there were countries. Africa is a continent. So there were, as you're aware, but just like to listeners, and many of our communities were already engaged in trade. Okay. And I know we'll talk about like climate change later and how like this all connects to trade routes, but there was trade that was ongoing within African communities, like within countries within the African continent. And we were already building our own boats. We already had relationships across the waters with other communities, because some of them were our relatives. Some of them were folks we had met in the trade route, right? And so we didn't need to be, there were communities who we were kings and queens. We knew how to do our own boats, you know what I'm saying? We knew how to do economics. Okay, we had whole civilizations. We're not brand new. And so with that, my people were among the first peoples who came here in those settlement and those trades. And even one of the first transitional periods of climate change. We'll talk about, wait a minute, climate change existed before now? Yes, it did. But it impacted trade in a way to where my community settled here in the Appalachians. And so we have been here a very long time, and we're indigenous in the fact that we came here and settled with a lot of other Native American indigenous cultures before the settlement and installation of the United States, before the settlement of colonization. And so with that, we lived in harmony. We had our own kingdom and we lived in harmony with tribes. So when you think about, I like to always use this example, we hear about Pocahontas all the time in Disney, hate that depiction. Don't know if it's copyrighted, but
very
I'm very, we won't get, but there's a reason that they really, it's a mockery. And there's a reason is because like her father was the chieftain of the Powhatan Nation, the Powhatan Confederacy, that word. Okay, wait a minute. We've heard that word, but not usually in a positive light for Black and brown folks. But that word was used before colonization as a descriptor of an entire consortium of tribes. So he was like the president. You had African indigeneity, like you had African tribes that had similar structures, which is, again, where my people come from. These were powerful strongholds in states in different counties, right? We already had systems of government. Why do you think we still call the chief of the United States chief of staff? Why do you think over close to half of the United States still has its indigenous names? Minnesota, Tennessee, California, Arizona, we can keep going. They are Michigan. All those indigenous words, they were not even renamed. So lazy, didn't even rename them. Okay, anyway, even here, when I talk about, Georgia and the connectivity of North Carolina, we have the Appalachian, the AT Trail. What's Appalachian? What's Tuskegee? So, So even though our name and our identity has been attempted to be erased, our mark cannot be replaced, period. Like our name is here. And so when you hear about these names that usually describe a river or a location, but it's still an indigenous name, right? And so when we look at that, my people are part of the settlement of the Appalachians. We are, when you talk about ethnically and race, we're Black, we're African, we're Afro-Indigenous, but we're also Melungeon. People don't even really know what that is when you talk about race. People get real tripped up when you talk about ethnicity and race, right? Like they get that. And so a lot of the Black people who live along the Appalachians, that's from Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, all the way through. A lot of us have very, very incredibly deep ancestral roots to multiple, of course, countries in Africa, but also Bangladesh and India, two separate, in the same continent. That's a long history. But as far as that's just how ancient our roots as Black people run. But in America, that was a part of my community. And so during slavery, of course, we were enslaved, and it was a marker, a lot of colorism. There's another reason why they hid the plantation is because they could market this to keep us divided. But colorism was used as a scale, a tool to say, okay, if your pigment, your melanin was, this shade to this shade, we could enslave you and pretend that we just bought you on the boat. There was a divisive way that they could use policy to manipulate. So half of my family was able to remain free because they could prove that they were indigenous to the land, like they could prove through cemeteries, through previous writings. If you could write, we've been here. So then the law couldn't take the land. The other half of my family, if they couldn't prove that they had the land, like they didn't keep record, and they had a deeper shade of melanin, they were sold. So half my people were sold to Mississippi, right? So you had this division, and some of my people were indentured, which means they stayed in the Appalachian Mountains and got to stay on their land, but then they had to go work to the plantation next door. And so that's how I was able to grow up in proximity to these plantation. But my family that was in Mississippi is on my mom's side, and upon emancipation, they marched all the way back home. They're like, we know where home is, we going. And so as they marched, it was the former king of that settlement, of our settlement. So he marched, other families joined him that were related, other families that were like, I just need to go somewhere, I need a new home. And they refound the kingdom of the Happy Land. And trust, and I'll pause here, I know that there are scores of kingdoms and scores of villages of when we talk about indigenous folks, Native American folks that are royal blood, period. But it's been buried, no archives, no records. The reason the kingdom of the Happy Land is recorded is because our people filed a deed under this new government. They're like, well, you're not going to erase us. So they learned the new tricks. Because you got to understand, the law changed during slavery. 1776, that constitution being passed, slavery was already ongoing at that point. So these laws had changed. So when our people got free, not only did we have to figure out getting back home, we also had to figure out the new policies, the new laws, what prohibited us from regaining our land. And so in that, we were able to repurchase hundreds of acres in the Appalachian Mountains and put on the deed the Kingdom of the Happy Land. And so because of that, the United States was forced to recognize it as a kingdom. Hawaii did it second. And Hawaii and here in North Carolina, the United States said, okay, there's two royal kingdoms. We have to admit it because you used our system, used a deed, and we can't deny you. It's recorded. And so there was two kings and a queen, but then Congress passed an act not too long after the reclamation of the kingdom in Hawaii. They passed an act that no citizen here in the United States could ever again claim titles of nobility. And it was to effectively shut down this wave of reclamation of indigenous cultures and Native American cultures reclaiming their titles of nobility. It was like, let's cut it now. And so you could see that now the government is as it is, as it progresses. And this is why I'm in the work that I'm in.
Wow. Well, that was amazing. And I'm happy that you ended on that, because that was going to be like a personal question for me. How were you able to know your heritage and where you came from? And it looks like your people, your ancestors kept everything on record. And I love that you were able to bring that with you in a way. So thank you for that. And I know you kind of spoke earlier about climate change and how it all kind of, leads up to that. And so I know we had talked about like what environmental racism looks like today. I would love for you to touch on what environmental racism looks like today and what climate change looks like today.
Sure. So environmental racism, like I gave the historical backdrop, and so I'll catch it up. The same, again, Jim Crow era areas by which there was redlining, where we, our people couldn't receive mortgages, right, fairly. Mm-hmm. And guess what? We just saw Wells Fargo in the news recently, where guess what? So this is still happening. That's environmental racism. How do we get to that? Because housing is a human right. Fair, equitable, clean housing is a human right. But those after emancipation, Reconstruction, we maybe get to that later if we have time, but those Jim Crow lines of, again, mortgage lending practices that harmed communities from being able to build or restore their homes that were already built. That's another conversation. What you begin to see when you're talking about what is environmental racism now, those lines still exist. They still continue. Those homes are in proximity to corporations that are continually polluting the neighborhoods, the areas, the same way it did during slavery. And so today, 56% of all people of color in the United States live only 2 miles away from a toxic waste site. 56%. So over half of all people of color in the United States. That's not because we packed up and we were like, oh, I want to move beside a toxic waste site. No, it moved beside us. It was either instituted already there in the inception of this nation, or they ravaged our community, didn't allow mortgages to actually be given so that our property taxes and value, like we could actually buy into neighborhoods, or having renovation loans. If you had heirs property or you didn't have a formal will, you couldn't qualify for loans from the U.S. Department of Agriculture or these other U.S. departments that with federal funding that other communities could qualify for. So it allowed for the degradation of our neighborhoods. Now we see that in gentrification when our, homes are swept up with property taxes that are unpaid, or you see come in, your community is completely without access to healthy foods or grocery stores. Your community, again, has been underinvested in. Businesses are small or, again, underutilized. You begin to see this target in the strategic way of urban planning, city planning has allowed for our communities to degrade over time. So then when a developer comes in or a new city council is elected in, that's like, well, I want an urban plan and I want a dog park, and I want to attract this big developer. Let's just offer these communities who have never seen as much money as $25,000 or $50,000 or maybe even $100,000, right? If they go steep, let's just offer it to them. And then we'll resell their property for $500,000+. So we're seeing that a lot everywhere. We've seen it historically. We may rename gentrification, but it's been happening for a very long time. And we're seeing it really, really horribly, again, here in the capital of North Carolina, but it's pervasive across the nation. And so examples of environmental racism, I've already connected a few dots. One, housing impact, whether it's housing discrimination, mortgage lending discrimination, heirs property and changing laws where folks can't qualify for available funds like other communities, but we're told that we're just uneducated. No, it's a trick. Food insecurity. Our communities are further hurt and harmed by the fact that we don't have access to grocery stores, but we didn't create that. That's based on zoning laws. That's based on the fact that the mayor, the city council, county commissioners can literally create clauses by which a grocery store can't access a neighborhood legally because it's been zoned that way. We've seen that used as a racially a tool, a tactic. Two, when we look at what is environmental racism today, the fact that communities who are now hit by hurricanes, that this will connect to climate change. We have more frequent hurricanes, 500-year storms happening every other year or happening every year. And then what about those communities? We saw that with Hurricane Katrina, this economic disaster capitalism, where as soon as the disaster hit the shore, they didn't prioritize saving the people. They didn't prioritize getting the people back home into safe structures. They didn't even prioritize getting people back to their homes. Instead, they took the land, bought out all this property from under people, then changed policy so they couldn't come back home, and even had teachers in the thousands fired. A union was removed for teachers. That happened in Louisiana. And Hurricane Katrina was actually a testing ground to see if that kind of economic disaster capitalism would work. It did. So we've seen that in North Carolina. We've seen that in Georgia. We've seen that in South Carolina, where these tactics of using natural disasters that are now climate disasters because they're happening more frequently is hitting communities that can't survive, again, because guess what? They're closer to the shore, yes, but like Air's property communities, they couldn't qualify before for funding to strengthen their infrastructures, to renovate buildings to withstand a storm. And now that set them up for losing their homes, losing their infrastructures in that storm. It was a setup. It's been a setup for years. And then they're bought out. FEMA buyouts means their land can be bought so they can move, but then they stop becoming homeowners and they become renters all over again. So they're in debt, displaced from their land, refugees. That's ongoing. Like, these are all examples. Returning citizens, where do they return to? Communities where they come back home, they're living in hotels, yet what's the outreach? I know, Women Engaged, appreciate how much y'all do with voting and reach of folks that are in alternative housing structures. When they can't be in safe, affordable housing, like climate disasters, returning citizens in climate impacted areas, they have to go to hotels. But hotels aren't seen as tenant. Like, a hotel is literally in law in certain states, aren't seen as a big landlord when they are, when that's sometimes a primary housing for folks. So all of this intersects, and it is environmental racism. And I think the word environmental has been marketed to alienate our people, so that at the end of the day, it's really as simple as, if your air is unclean, it's dirty, and it's poisoning you and causing asthma, bronchial issues, you're living beside a poultry plant, or you can smell that stench and ooh, that's that smell. 3 o'clock, we're going to smell it. Honey, that's environmental racism, because what you're smelling is also something poisonous. Because if it stinks, there's something that's not right. And oftentimes we know the smell, or we know the marker, but we have to name it in community terms, because we're the most impacted. We should also be the author of how we define that impact, so that other people can recognize that impact and recognize the solution to that impact. So that's some examples of environmental racism. There's a whole lot more, but I'll pause there.
No, I love that. And that's, before I could fully grasp the concept of environmental racism, I always said, you will find in predominantly Black neighborhoods, you will see a fast food restaurant literally on every single corner, matched with a liquor store. Everyone. And maybe there'll be one grocery store in like a 10-mile radius. But if you go to, white suburban areas, grocery stores on every single corner, a Whole Foods there, Trader Joe's there, and you will never see certain, grocery chains in certain neighborhoods. That's right. And that's the one thing I would always bring up before I fully grasp. I was like, I know that one. I know that that's environmental racism. But thank you for explaining that. And I feel like with that explanation, people can finally see, like, oh, wait a minute, this is impacting me. And they may not realize it. And I know we talked a little bit about environmental racism. I would love for us to kind of get into climate change.
Sure. Yeah. So, and I just appreciate your just how you've already honed in on food insecurity. I could talk about that for so long. And I was talking to someone the other day who is an expert and has worked in sanitation services and literally dumping out sewage out of the manholes. And what they were telling me is sometimes we don't know that there's a regular routine because it's just not present of mind, that when there's flooding and then you have like disaster, really nasty stuff in your water, sewage and stuff, in certain communities, it has an influx of that because the city, depending on where you are, won't regularly dump out the sewage out of manholes in Black and brown neighborhoods or low wealth neighborhoods. And they have more of a structure where they'll go to a system where they'll go to suburban neighborhoods with higher property taxes and clean out their manholes more frequently. But what it means is in certain neighborhoods, ours will overflow. So just you talking about that, I'm just all like thinking about all the, as you're talking about how people can see the signs. Look in your manholes. See if they're, well, don't look at them, but if there's sewage, that's another example of environmental racism. Like, why is there filth everywhere? That's why. In the policy. Climate change, so again, climate change is a word that just seems so, okay, the climate changes.
Yeah.
The change of the climate. It just doesn't sound, okay. And so it just sounds so, and you hear this kind of polarizing partisanship that comes with it, right? Like you're either affiliated with this party if you believe it, or it's all this divisive nature, but it's really distracting, right? It's deflection. And so at the end of the day, climate change, how we see it today, and then I'll back up again because it's very important. Farmers, folks who work with the land already know. Folks who work with wildlife, who fish, they can already tell you the change in the temperature, the change in the quality of the seasons, how our seasons are not long enough in weeks in duration, or it kills the crops, or they can't replenish it in the same way they would have. They're having to change their methods. And so even our growing seasons, our growing periods are shifting and have shifted. And farmers have been like, whoa, wait a minute. When we talk about sports folks, like folks who are literally hunters and they're out here like living off the land, foraging off the land, they can tell you the shift in migration patterns. The land speaks. And so if you're connected to the land, if that's your economic vehicle is to be directly connected to that land, you'll know that there's a difference in again the earth itself, a difference in how animals are responding, wildlife's responding, how fish are responding. Now, what we have to connect though in climate change is the corporate responsibility. Again, it ties back to the plantation, the corporation, because us as individuals, especially Black and brown folks, we are not the top consumers, which means we're not buying the most. That requires the most products being made. Mm-hmm. We are the most polluted, but we're not the highest consumers. Mm-hmm. But what that means is corporations are trying to keep up with consumerism, and they are being extractive. And the more they have to create, the more pollution they create. So then you're going to have really dirty air that has higher, literally particles of chemicals that's in our neighborhood. So when you see that smokestack, or you see certain plants, corporations, and it can vary. It can, go from animal, pork, large, not small farms, pork industrial farms, or poultry industrial farms, or you're looking at the textile mill or cotton mill. Anyway, what is permeating the air, what is putting back into our soil is contaminants that can't be filtered out, and then it goes into our bodies, like PFAS, PFAS. And this is a chemical that you literally, like, it's used to waterproof everything from your shoes, stain repellent on your carpet, but it is been dumped into our waterway, our largest one here in North Carolina. But this has been an issue across the nation. Like, this is not the first case, and it's global too. But the issue is these are chemicals that our bodies can't break down because they're not organic. So when we're talking about climate change, corporations are creating really, really large sources of contamination that makes the Gulf of Mexico catch on fire. Things that has nothing to do with us doing single-use plastics and it's up to you to recycle and let's put the blame on one. No, it is a mass corporation that is overproducing and then dumping negligently, like their filth, like they've been doing for years. And something I really want to name, we've had climate change before, during AD and BC. Okay, there was a period called the medieval warm period. Now, some people will argue the medieval warm period, yes, for 300 years, it changed the temperature of the earth completely to where it changed how people lived. It literally changed human systems the same way it's happening now. But people will argue, oh, but greenhouse gas emissions, the big, like, again, pollution from your cars and the carbon and these big, that didn't exist then. So it was natural. Okay, now that's, again, like I said, scientists, they talk about it. I'm gonna let them, I'm not but what I am going to challenge is the fact that there was a warm period that was 300 years in duration in the medieval times that allowed for the redistribution of heat to circulate around the planet. And because that heat change was so immense, you saw ecosystem shift. So Northern Europe actually became warmer. Their agriculture spread. They were able to get more food surplus, because formerly it was so cold that they would have to fight over the limited amount of land that they had and the limited amount of, like, arable land that they could use. But because of this warmth change, they had food surplus. They had vineyards. And then guess what? It also helped them to colonize other areas because it was warm. And so what we saw during that medieval period of time is these colonizing empires begin to start to spread to other nations and oppress them. And even we saw that in Asia with Genghis Khan. It literally happened because it was easier for him to launch attacks because the climate was wetter because of that heat. But even though it was positive for Europe and it was positive for Asia, it wasn't positive for Central America. It wasn't positive for North America. It wasn't positive for Black and brown communities, because for them, it became warmer and wetter. For us, it became more of a drought. So for 300 years, the Mayan civilization, great, huge empire, North America, we faced such a drought that it removed our food surpluses and placed us in, of course, an impacted way of life, lost a lot of our ground, economic benefit, because we're an agricultural, right, driven society in these continents. Okay, but that was medieval. So when we talk about climate change, the reason I say that is because nothing's new under the sun, and we have to begin to identify that the same systems that are being replicated here, the same corporations that's polluting us, it did the same thing years ago during those climate change periods, and it's still happening now. And then I'll pause here. When we talk about lead, for example, we're very familiar with lead. That's an old, like, at least in the United States, it's like, oh my goodness, lead should be outlawed. We're still struggling to get lead out of water. But what blew my mind, and I have to credit, actually, my mom's in the same line of work, I have to credit her research for this. She was like, well, lead has been in use for thousands of years. I said, what do you mean by that? What you mean by that? Because we only been here a couple of hundred. So what you mean? And so diving deeper in the research, lead has been in use for 6,000 years. The research on the toxicity of lead has been around for 2,500 years. It was found in Egyptian cultures that they mined for lead because it's a natural, it comes from Earth. Hebrew, the culture mined for lead. The Roman Empire would literally mine 60,000 metric tons a year for 400 years of lead. And it was so toxic because they would use it to make metal utensils. Sound familiar? Sound kind of modern, don't it? And they would use it to make even containers to hold wine. And because only the rich bourgeoisies, the patricians, could afford the wine and plumbing, they were the ones with the highest level of lead. So a lot of they had high rates of infant mortality, high rates of diseases. It's already been proven from a Roman Empire before the United States was even a thought. This has already been proven, and it is literally attributed to being a part of the reason that Rome fell. Was environmental contamination. So when we talk about climate change, these warm periods, all this was happening at the same time. We're repeating the same cycle. So as a community and as communities of people, we have to be aware that the same practices of overconsumerism, large corporations doing whatever it takes to make profit by taking all of our resources, in return, they're destroying the earth, and they're literally doing the same extractive processes with the same contaminants from 6,000 years ago. Okay, well, how did Rome end? How did empire fare? Let's look at all of them.
No, that's like, why are we not learning from people's mistakes? You would think, this seems a little familiar. Why are we not switching it up? But I guess history does have to repeat itself sometimes if no one's listening or reading. But thank you for that. Like, that's wild to me that this is literally history repeating itself. And I know, like, I do like understand climate change to a certain extent, but like I know when I talk to my friends or peers or like my cousins about it, I'll just say, girl, it was 27 degrees yesterday. Today it is 73 degrees. Something's not right here.
Right.
Something is not right. Especially because we all know Georgia has really weird weather anyway, but it's been a lot weirder than usual. So that's what I always bring up. Like the temperatures, this weather is not. I've been here my entire life. It's getting really horrible.
Right.
So thank you for that. And I know you kind of spoke on like connecting with the land. And so I would love for us to kind of talk about, I guess, like creating more unity between Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous, and Africans across, this country, and how we can all get back into connecting with the land, protecting it, and honoring the land we're on together. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
That's such a great question. That is such a great question. I tend to, I feel like an ongoing discussion that we should, in unification, be having with one another on a regular routine, like on a regular basis. And the reason I say that is because, I may have an idea of what liberation looks like that'll look different depending on the person, the family, the community, the country, the continent, right? But where that unification starts, and like you and I are having this conversation about, this history, because I'm a big history person. I'm like, if I don't learn my own history, I have no idea what's already been done to my people, that they fought for me to be here, that I should be learning from, but I can't be in such an ego humanist, like this hubris mindset to be like, oh, I got it from here. No, honey, you don't. Like, how do you think we made it? And that's the key, right? Is one of the main ties is, I hate the word resiliency because I'm tired of being resilient. I'm good at it, but I'm tired. Let me choose when I want to be resilient. But on a serious note, well, that is a serious note, but on an extended note, is that the liberation model for all people is tied in our collective struggle of, again, Black and people of color. And I make that, delineation as someone from the United States, that we've had to struggle for our identity. Even though we get, because to be real with you, you can go to other countries and ask where the white person is and they don't know what that term is. And you can also go and ask where the Black person is and they don't know what that word is. So again, that's language, which creates sometimes a barrier. So that's a part of, destigmatizing and unifying our shared struggle. But we have to come together to have these conversations, because how we survive these oppressive systems, because Rome decided what they were going to do, but that wasn't in consensus of the Black and brown folks, by which they also terrorized and colonized. But the same folks survived, which is why ancestors, they have descendants. And we are descendants of someone. And so if we come together and really think about how is our resiliency shaped our ability to survive, that is literally the key of salvation for our period, our globe, when it comes to climate change. We have the answers because we live it every day, or we wouldn't be here. Imagine how oppressed, how subjugated, how extracted we have been, yet we're still here gleaming, shining, honey, joy, period. Like, it is just... There's no logic, right? At some point, it's like, okay, how have you been the most polluted, the most contaminated? How, you're contracting all these, diseases. You don't have access to food, security, even internationally. Our e-waste. I had a student who educated me on this, and I was so appreciative that they're like, well, okay, when you throw away your laptop, when you throw away your cell phone, where do you think it goes? Okay, they have it where they dump it into landfills in countries in Africa. And it is so dangerous what literally leaches, obviously, from your devices into the ground, that creates these horrific diseases and illnesses. But here's the bad part. It creates an economic source of it creates revenue, because those communities will literally go and pull out the tech out of these landfills so they can refurb it and sell it to make money to live. So our waste, which is killing folks, is killing them at the same time of providing them economic, vehicle for revenue. That's painful. because you begin to realize it's the corporations who benefit over and over and over again. And even when they technically don't even have to sell, they can just dump their waste, and their waste is going to be picked right back up, killing people who are our cousins, our distant relatives. And so it's that connection. So we have to be in community. We have to talk and be very clear with, we are equally oppressed by some of the same corporations. The same corporation in Georgia that is harming us with utilities, same ones in North Carolina, the same ones with coal ash, but we begin to see remnants of where coal burning, we can see that in the global South. It's the connectivity. And I really do believe that environmental justice, which again, give an ode to the elders and the ancestors for birthing that movement. I think the reclamation of to your point, our marriage to the land. And when and there's been a purposeful, intentional attack to separate us from the land, right? Like when you're enslaved on your own land, you begin to hate it. It's pain. It's trauma. And then now we're having to heal the wounds of, many of us didn't reclaim our land. And when we did reclaim our land, it was so harmed, we had to restore it back to health. And then it was stolen again through gentrification, through land loss, through public universities that were PWIs who literally stole the land with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's been a painful history of them continually pulling us away from our natural resources. And there's a reason for that, because we're tied. Our land systems, we can be sovereign and independent if you can grow your own food.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Thank you for that. And that, I love that, because I know a lot of people struggle with, especially Black Americans here, struggle with going back into their lineage and like just accepting and embracing, I guess, just African culture, and African culture specifically, honoring the land that we are on, connecting to the land that we are on. So I know sometimes people are like, oh no, that's a little weird. Like for me, I would go out and just step in the grass barefoot. My mom calls me country because I walk around everywhere barefoot. She hates it, but I love it. I will go outside, go get the mail, go step in my lawn and just be barefoot. I love it. And that's me connecting with the land that I'm on. And I know like a lot of Black Americans kind of struggle with that. So I love that you kind of bridge the gap between that. And I know you kind of talked about earlier, like with big corporations and how they are basically ruining our planet. And it's really crazy to me that we're told, reduce your footprint, your digital footprint, I remember in school, they were telling us to ride bikes to work when we get jobs, and like, don't get a car, do this to reduce your footprint, recycle, and we can save the planet. But it's kind of not our fault that the planet is in this predicament in the first place. But I would love for us to kind of touch on what we can do, the little that we can do to preserve the environment and to honor the land we're on in this moment in time.
Oh, I just appreciate you. I knew we were twin spirits. Like when we showed up kind of dressed alike, you know what I'm saying? We got, you know what I'm saying? Yes. And the same, like when in spaces when people do grounding exercises, technically it's if COVID has changed a lot, you would go outside to ground yourself, because it's grounding, it is a purpose. And we could totally get into all that conversation and how it's healing. I love these conversations. So we'll connect later. It to this point, to your point, right? Like we were the original environmentalists. Mm-hmm. And I don't have to go too far back in history to name that a lot of our grandparents had cast iron skillets and big old heavy pans. Okay. A lot of our people were already recycling 50-11 grocery bags. Okay, we're going to grocery bag going to be the hair conditioning bag. It's going to be
I'm all under my speak right now. Yes.
Look, you need a trash bag. It's going to help you clean out your car. I mean, literally. And so when I say those moments, for us, we historically, and I've said this in certain speeches in the past, that you could go in your grandparents, parents, great-grandparents' refrigerator and think you're pulling out like a Cool Whip container, whipped cream. Nope. You open it up.
Leftovers. Last night's dinner. Yes.
Disappointment. Yes. Sometimes it's joy, but you see all these practices. Like you and I could probably go down a list. Folks who are listening in the comments, depending on their culture of being American, they could probably list like, oh yeah, I remember they used to use the same fatback grease to put it then and there, or they always had a jar of grease on the back of the stove where they would literally use that same grease to refry, or the same grease to then go. We could talk about those systems of being honest, again, goes back to understanding what our people have done for years. We have, and there's this really great herb book by Michelle E. Lee. And she did a literal deep dive, and I believe that's her name, the author, amazing book of herbs and African-American traditions and Native American traditions, where she literally went in person. We have to begin actually documenting what we have done for years, because now it's being commodified and marketed and resold back to us like it's this new, oh my goodness, sustainable agriculture, biodegradable containers. You're hearing this language, cast iron skillets. Now they're going for price. Kale, which we used to could get for cheap.
I had to start growing kale. I'm not doing that. Not doing that.
Not doing it. And so a lot of us already have these stories. First, it's unearthing what is the history within our own culture to document those actual old traditions, one. Two, it's sharing those traditions and seeing where can we strengthen them? Where do we get community cast iron skillets? Like when I would do community workshops, I would actually bring cast iron skillets and give them out. And so it's that mutual aid that unfortunately is put on our backs that we already do, but it's in teaching the next generation or the people that are with us right now that we don't just do this because it's an old tradition. We do this because it saves us. And that's what's really important. And oftentimes we don't get credit. We are devalued, but we already have these systems of resiliency. And then last is just being aware and sharing the knowledge that sometimes all the time these corporation structures, they are benefiting from a system of our miseducation and our uneducation that is not being told to us how they are extracting our land, our lives, and they're just using it for the gain of a few to our demise, and that's global. And so that awareness also can help us to look at practices that are not sustainable and say, well, maybe I need to back up from investing in corporations in this way, and I need to return back to the land in a way that I can grow and be autonomous in case this empire falls like Rome. Where are we going to be? And are we going to know how to live off the land and educate our own folks?
Wow. So many light bulbs just went off. I love that. And it is really cool to think about how we are already practicing preserving the land and protecting our environment. Like I forgot who I was talking to, but somebody was eating like pig feet. I was like, gross. But they were like, well, we eat every part of the animal. We use every part of the animal. When we do eat meat, well, I'm a pescatarian, but people around me, they eat every part of the animal. And that's protecting our environment and honoring the land that we're on. So, oh my God, I love this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. And I just have one question. It's kind of, a little off topic, but kind of just talk about self-care, because here at Women Engaged, we really put up front self-care and what we do to take care of ourselves, because sometimes in this work and in this space, it can be a little heavy. So I would love to see how you practice self-care doing the work that you do.
Yeah, so this year's theme is two things. So radical rest and stay in your lane, 2022, stay in your lane. And that's for me when I be doing too much, and that's for other people when they doing too much. I'm like, okay, go in your lane. And so we have self-care. I'm telling, look. And so I've had to really think about self-care for me as a person in this movement. And I'm fortunate to have a really great support system that is also energized by this same level of like history and conversation exploration. But that's not the world we live in. And I am afforded the privilege of now being in a pathway that I get paid. I didn't get paid for many years to do this. Now I am, but I understand that many of our communities are trying to escape oppression. They work every single day in these corporations, from McDonald's to Hardee's. Those are corporations too. And they're not trying to come home and see state-sanctioned violence on the TV. And they're not trying to come home and they're trying to escape. And so I do love a level of escapism that is unique to me and is not unique to what's being marketed on Instagram and social media of what's cute self-care. I read research documents 24/7, 365. I read. I don't want to read a book in my free time. I'm sorry. That's like, like I had to,
that's honest. I love that.
Period. And so I've had to be really honest that sometimes my self-care changes to being in a space where my escapism can look different. It can be watching a television show that resonates with my soul, like I'm currently catching up on Bel Air. Could have a whole conversation on that. And so I'm catching up, or sometimes it's looking at new plants, looking at new herbs, trying out like new tinctures, and like how can I play with the land, because that's how I get reconnected. I'm a musician, so sometimes I'll play guitar, but that's because that was invested in me as a kid. And sometimes it's literally just sitting and talking about things that really frustrate me with people who are frustrated by the same content, and not people that I'm asking them to hold the burden of content that I know that they're not in a place to hold. And sometimes I have to be honest with my self-care has to also be my people's care. Because if I don't think about them, it hurts me more, because then you get in a conflict and argument of trying to wake people up. It's not your role. It's what I find, stay in your lane. So that's some things, self-care. There's a lot of commercialism out here, going to the gym all that. I ain't successful at that. I'm trying.
Yeah, no, I felt that. I felt that. No, I love that. And you just I need to stay in my lane. I think I'm gonna take that from you. I think that's what I'm gonna hold. Because sometimes when people say certain things, you just want to be like, I can fix you. And you're like, nah, it's okay. If they want to learn, they can learn on their own. I'll do my best. But at some point, if it's affecting me, I'm not gonna do that. But I love that. I love sci-fi, not sci-fi, but like fantasy stuff. So I've been watching Game of Thrones, and I'm currently watching The Witcher. Oh my goodness, that show is amazing. So I had to tell myself to go to bed last night, because I was gonna finish the entire season 1. But I was like, let me go to bed, get some rest. But
I knew we were twins, though. I knew.
Love that show. I love fantasy, anything. I'm really weird. I like gore. I like all of it. So I'm obsessed with that show. But thank you so much for joining us today. I definitely had a fangirl moment. Ever since I saw you on a panel a couple months ago, I was like, I need her on this show. I need it. So thank you so much for joining us. And I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Zoe. And also thank you. Shout out to Malika Redman. Your chat was on fire and I just saw it. So thank you for your comments too. But thank you for having me, Zoe. And thank you to Women Engaged, and just, and the honor of me being here and being able to speak in Georgia as well, virtually. So thank you.
Thank you. And I just kind of want to talk about a little bit of updates for Women Engaged. We're hiring digital canvassers right now. So if you would like to come on as a digital canvasser, please visit our website, and also visit our website for other campaigns, and stay up to date on our social media at Women Engaged. So you can just kind of see the things that we're working on. But this was Yala, Environmental Racism. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I will see you guys next Friday.